Hi everyone, this is Andrew Duncan, and today I'm going to do a brief presentation on why I believe we as teachers are truly the givers of language. Now we have to start with the first question of what exactly is language? And while the official definition is a bit long and difficult to wrap your head around, my definition is simply that language is our method of conveying our thoughts and feelings to other people. So it's simply how we communicate with others around us. Now, in order to gain language skills, you can either learn a language or you can acquire a language. Now, these are very similar, and most people probably think they're the same exact thing, but there are subtle differences that make them not quite the same. So, learning is more of a conscious process of understanding grammatical rules and formalities of a language. So, this is the more formal process of studying a language to become familiar with it and to use it day to day. Now, acquisition refers more to a subconscious process. So, this is where you listen to people around you speaking a language and you pick up on these language skills and differences between languages and you begin using them that way. And this is a lot more informal than learning a language. Now, I use these two pictures to represent that because, as I said, learning, it's more studying, book work, stuff like that, whereas acquisition is more casual, day to day scenarios where you pick up on a language. Now, first language acquisition is very interesting because there is a predictable sequence, but these events in the sequence can happen at different ages and they can last different durations of time. Now, even though they last different durations and can happen at different ages, there is a predictable sequence we go through. And the first stage is babbling, which is around 6 to 8 months, which is repeated sequences being produced. So, for example, I put mama on this slide because it's a repeated sequence. Now, the second stage is the one word stage or the holophrastic stage, which is 9 to 18 months. And this is where we begin using single words to label things. So, for example, I have a picture of a car and I put above it car. Or let's say you're walking outside and you see a flower and you call it a flower. This is the holophrastic stage. Now, stage 3 is referred to as the two-word stage, which is 18 to 24 months. Now, this is where we begin producing mini sentences. So, for example, we see this girl with her dog, and she would say, doggy big. So, it's a miniature sentence to represent what she's trying to say. Now, the fourth stage is referred to as the telegraphic or early multi-word stage, which is 24 to 30 months. Now, at this stage, we're still leaving out grammatical and functional morphemes. So, for example, we would say, pig say oink, instead of the pig makes this sound. It gets the general idea across, but it's still not perfect grammatically. And then once we get to the fifth stage, this is the later multi-word stage, which is 30 months or even beyond then. And this is where we just continue to develop our language and make conversation-like sentences. Now, whenever it comes to second language development, it's actually very similar to first language development. It's just typically the difference comes in when it's acquired or learned. So we go through similar stages, and the stages still exist, but it's just at a different time usually. So when acquiring a second language, there are also 5 stages. So the first is the silent or receptive stage, where students may typically be silent in this stage, like completely silent, or they may say few limited words. That's simply because they're not quite comfortable speaking in their second language yet. So this could last, an hour or two, or it could last a day or a week. It truly just depends on the student. Then they move into the early production stage. Now, this is where they begin to collect new words and actually say some things and not quite make sentences, but this is kind of like the two-word sentences that we go through in first language acquisition. Then we move into the speech emergence or production stage. Now, this is where we've collected a couple of thousand words and we can actually begin piecing together some coherent phrases and sentences that actually make sense. We then move into intermediate fluency, which this is where you actually might even begin thinking in your second language, which is pretty interesting. Then we move into the fifth stage, which is continued language development or proficiency, and this, simply put, is just like the last stage of first language acquisition, where you're just developing your language skills to become more fluent and coherent. Now, comparing the first language and the second language, the first language, as I was trying to explain, is usually acquired rather than learned. We're picking up on this through our environment, through listening to people actually speaking the language. Now, can a second language come about in this way? Yes, it can, especially whenever you're a simultaneous bilingual, which is someone who is attaining both languages at the same time. But whenever it comes to something called a sequential bilingual, these are people who develop their second language after the first. So this is where you typically learn the language rather than acquire it. And here's just a small chart to explain the differences and similarities between language 1 and language 2. Language 1, you don't always need instruction because, like we were talking about, you acquire that language. Whereas the second language, you typically do require instruction, and teachers should use a variation of strategies when trying to get students comfortable in their second language. So, for example, they should use pictures while instructing their students. Now, when it comes to the actual similarities, there are quite a few. There are similar views of the acquisition order. So, as I was talking about before, first and second language acquisition or learning, you go through the same stages. They just happen at different times, but the stages still exist and they still all present themselves. So we touched on this topic of the silent period. Now, what exactly is the silent period? This is a period before someone is completely comfortable speaking in their new language. So they're still having trouble expressing their thoughts orally. Now, this gets into the concept of receptive versus expressive vocabulary. So receptive is where you can receive information and understand it, but you can't exactly express your thoughts and feelings yet with that language. Whereas expressive vocabulary is you can express yourself with that vocabulary. Now, how can we as teachers help students through this silent period? Well, we kind of have to simplify what we're trying to get across to the students. And what I mean by that is we should ask questions that elicit a yes or no nod in response. And we should consider different actions as responses. So, for example, smiling or even flipping through pages whenever the student understands what we're asking them to do. We could also use some easily recognizable words from the student's language. So, for example, in English we have the word pencil, whereas in Spanish we have un lápiz. We should also use images to convey our messages because they're very simply put a way of seeing what we're actually trying to get the student to understand. And now this is a very interesting way to help students through the silent period, but we should observe their playground behavior. And what I mean by that is, in a casual setting, a student will be more comfortable attempting to use and acquire and learn their language, as opposed to a classroom setting where it's a bit more intimidating. So if we can watch a student on the playground talk to their friends, that means they might be a little bit more comfortable speaking in that language and they can continue developing those skills that way. Okay, so now we're going to discuss the concept of bilingualism. So what exactly is bilingualism? It's where a person is fluent in two languages. Now, this gets a little bit difficult to understand because fluent can mean two different things. You don't have to be equally fluent in both languages to be considered fluent in both languages. And this is simply because languages can be acquired at the same time or learned at different times. So if you're learning a language later on in life, you're not going to be quite as fluent in the second language as you are the first language, but that doesn't mean you're not bilingual. Now, what would I consider not bilingual? Probably myself. Now, as I said in my reflection paper, I learned a bit of Spanish when I was in 8th and 9th grade, but if you asked me to create a coherent sentence in Spanish right now, I could not do so. So I'm not bilingual in that sense. So what impacts on learning does bilingualism have? Well, learning a second language actually does not have any negative impacts on the first language, and it doesn't negatively impact your learning in English. Now, there's a lot of negative perceptions that learning two languages at a time can be sort of learning overload and it's too difficult. But this is actually the complete opposite of what the case is, because throughout the first 3 years of your life, your brain is the most changeable. You have the highest level of brain plasticity, meaning that you can pick up on things as learning to walk or even learning to speak And it'll be a lot more simple to acquire two languages at a time than to acquire one language and to learn one later on. So, what are some benefits of being bilingual? Well, bilingual students have a greater amount of cognitive flexibility and self control, and they're also better at solving mental puzzles, so sorting objects by shape and color. Now, these mostly come about because the brain is getting a workout whenever it's switching back and forth between two languages or picking a language to stay in. Now, bilingualism also helps students learn because they can develop a greater vocabulary range, and they also have faster forming phonological awareness skills. Now, we can also discuss the concept of object permanence. Now, in a normal context, object permanence refers to, and this is a good example I can think of, if there's a ball on the floor and you shove a ball under a bed, you know that it's still there and that it still exists. That's what object permanence means. Even though it's out of sight, it still exists. Now, in this context, object permanence refers to knowing that an object is the same thing, even though you're giving it two different names. So the English word for a cup is cup, whereas the Spanish word is taza. Now, we still know that it is the same object, even though we're giving it a different word to explain what it is. So adults can also benefit from bilingualism, actually greatly so. They can have better concentration skills and answer questions quicker on attention tests. Now, this is mainly due to that workout the brain is receiving when switching between the languages or picking a language and sticking with it. They also have better focus during lectures and are better at retaining relevant information, which, as a college student, I can tell you is extremely vital. Now, an amazing benefit to bilingualism is actually that it can protect against Alzheimer's disease and delay it by up to 4 years. And I like to think of it like this: even though 4 years does not seem like a crazy long amount of time, looking at how long a human life is, it is actually a very significant proportion of a life. So, how do we as teachers benefit ELL students? Now, don't get me wrong, a great teacher is a great thing to have, but they alone cannot provide everything that's necessary for an ELL student. So we should work with specialists to create coherent instruction, meaning that whatever the specialist is working on with the student, we should incorporate that into our lectures as well. So a great example of this is, let's say I teach 3rd grade and I send my students to their music class. The music teacher will go through a specific song or a specific concept, and then if I collaborate with them and include that song or concept into my lecture, that greatly builds upon that concept, and it creates a sense of parallelism between my class and the music class, where the student will continue to become better with these concepts. Now, when it comes to a learning theory that kind of goes along with my idea of language development, I chose developmental learning theory because it's naturally occurring stages that happen in an orderly fashion. Now, these stages occur gradually, but they develop at different rates in different people. And now, what I like to say is, whenever it comes to language development, we all go through the same stages. The same stages exist for everyone. It's just a different rate or a different age at which we go about going through those stages. So this kind of goes along with the concept of learning happens when the student is ready, which is exactly what it means. You go through these stages whenever you're ready to go through them, and the teacher just provides scaffolding to get you through these stages efficiently and effectively. So to sum it all up, we as teachers, we're providing the necessary resources and scaffolding for language learning, which means we are absolutely responsible for providing language, and the study of language is greatly our concern. So once we give the students the stuff that they need to acquire and learn a language, they piece it all together and go through these stages of language development, making we, the teachers, the givers of language. Now, here are the resources I used to create this PowerPoint. And that's everything. Thank you very much.